Greetings, students. My name is Mr. Little, and on today's Bite of History, we're going to look at Chapter 20, Part 2, State Building in the Americas. By the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer these essential questions. How can the diversity of state forms in the Americas be explained? How did the states of the Mexica, the Inca, and the Cahokia form the Americas during this time? And how did these states maintain their authority and order during this time? So let's start quick with the smaller states. So the Cahokia, as stated in part 1 of this, was a religious center in what is now Missouri in the United States. There were a number of smaller settlements around this large religious center, and they seem to probably have used a common language and worshipped a common religion. They farmed maize, beans, and squash, and they used the Mississippi River as their irrigation source. They did build large temples, and we know that they practiced human sacrifice to a small extent, both when a great leader died, but also sometimes to gain the will of the gods. Now, the Mississippi, aka the Cahokian, are famous in particular for their gigantic mounds. We sometimes call them the Mississippi Mound Builders, because they built these large earthen mounds to bury their deceased leaders in, and these also served as temples. So the Pueblo of the American Southwest and the Mayan city-states of southern Mexico and northern Central America are a little bit different. They're numerous individual communities that are tied together via language, and the Pueblo adapted to their environment by building their houses not separately from their environment, but literally into the cliffs of their environment. And while they also practiced agriculture, they moved locations when the climate became unfavorable. And so throughout the history of the Pueblo people, there are numerous migrations back and forth to more favorable locations. The Maya, on the other hand, built large stone cities with temples, elaborate irrigation systems, water collection system, a priestly class, farming, and they also fought with one another. So the Maya were more city-states that we might be used to in the mold of, say, northern Italy or the Swahili city-states. Let's talk about the centralized states. So the Mexica, aka the Aztecs, sometimes also called the Triple Alliance because it was an alliance of 3 cities, begins around 1428. According to Aztec legend, they migrated from the north down to Lake Texcoco, and they had a bit of a reputation for causing trouble, which got them kicked out of a lot of places. And so they were exiled out to this lake, and they built these plots of mud. They dredged mud from the bottom of the lake and created these artificial plots of land called Chinampas, on which they were able to grow food. And through growing this food and growing their population, eventually they built the city of Tenochtitlan on Lake Texcoco using canals and dikes and other water control methods to build this beautiful shining city on a lake. Further south, in the Andes Mountains of South America, in what's now Peru, Ecuador, and parts of Chile, another group settled around a place called Lake Titicaca, and also began to practice agricultural innovations, such as something called the Waru, which is a raised agricultural bed, and hillside terracing, which is a fancy way of saying they built farmland into hills by creating artificial ledges. This group established Cusco as their capital in 1463, and both of these empires were off to a start. But notice how they both settled around lakes and have a history of moving around. Now, the Mexica, part of their founding legend is their migration to Lake Texcoco, and they claim to be connected to another great Central American state called the Toltecs, which were further north than they were. And so this is part of their lore, and their legend is their connection to the Toltecs. Now, the Mexica built an empire that was based largely on conquest and the demanding of tribute from subjected people. Now, they had a reputation for being troublemakers, and they played this to their strength. They would regularly compose armies and go on campaigns, not necessarily to conquer territory, but to gather tribute and remind subjected people that, hey, you belong, you're in our empire, and you're going to pay us tribute, or we're going to come out and we're going to, murder some people and we'll raid you. War was more about gaining loot and respect rather than actually conquering territory. As you can imagine, this didn't make the Mexica very popular amongst their subject people. Now, the Inca, by contrast, they also used existing technologies and existing connections to previous states that had existed in their same area. But their empire was much more about incorporating people. And so, for example, the army of the Inca, when it was raised, tended to include peoples from every corner of the empire, whereas the army of the Mexica and their empire was almost entirely made up of Mexica and people very close to the Mexica. Now, the Inca also built this great elaborate road system, and to this day, there are still 25,000 miles of road that you can find in the Andes that were built by the Inca. They also used an elaborate system of runners and communication posts. If that sounds familiar, the Mongols did something similar. They also had, interestingly enough, a system of record keeping that was not a written language. It was something called a Quipu. And a Quipu is actually a string with a series of knots, and the size of the knot and the proximity of the knot to other knots is designed to keep records and messages. It's actually quite innovative. It's one of the, this hasn't actually been seen in other parts of the world throughout history. So the Inca created a very interesting empire. Now, in terms of the religion and the state, the Mexica had a tight relationship between the ruling class and the priestly class. Now, while the rulers led the military, the priests ran the temples and conducted their ritual sacrifices. Usually the rulers would lead armies to war for the sole purpose of gaining humans to sacrifice. So there was a very tight connection between the rulers and the priests. Warriors were often awarded land after their campaigns, and so the Mexica expanded their empire via tribute and also to a small degree via settlement by colonists. For the most part, everybody who wasn't a priest, a ruler, or a warrior was a peasant or sometimes a slave from people who were forced to pay tribute to the Mexica. But it should be worth noting that a number of slaves in the Mexica Empire were just regular Mexica who had fallen into debt. So slavery was not strictly based on warfare. The Inca, by contrast, they also had a tight relationship with the priestly class and the ruling class, except in this case, the king of the Mexica, or the king of the Inca, were literally gods themselves. They are referred to as the god kings, right? And so you did have a ruling elite under them of bureaucrats and administrators who organized the quipus. And then below that, pretty much everybody else was a peasant. And it's worth noting that the Inca had a very interesting system of labor by which they had peasants pay taxes not in material goods, but via their labor. And so peasants were required to work a certain number of days out of the year, and that counted as their taxes. That's in part how the Inca were able to build these amazing road systems that we still see to this day. It's also worth noting that the choice of high gods can in some ways be reflected in how these societies ran themselves. So for example, in the Mexica, the warrior god was one of the highest gods, not the only god or the highest, but it was one of. There was also a deity who was made in part from maize. It was not a god of corn, but a god that had elements of corn in his physical appearance, right? And so war and corn, being two of the most important parts of Mexica society, were some of the most prized deities to worship. The Inca also had a sun god that was above all, and this is emphasized by the beautiful sun temple that was constructed in Cusco. My apologies, Cusco, the capital of the Incas. And many Inca leaders were mummified following their death, and so although many of them were lost during European colonialization, there were, many Inca leaders were kept for centuries after, or for decades after their death, because they were mummified so that they might not waste away. And the leaders were viewed as a source of wisdom even after death. And so in short, you can kind of compare and contrast the Mexica and the Inca based on some of their social structures as well as the deities that were prized for worship above all. So you should be able to answer those essential questions from the beginning of the slides. Thank you so much for joining me for this history bite, and I'll see you next time.